Yo, what's going on everyone? FreakyDude99 here, back at you with another post. It's Wednesday again, so another read through on the Lightfall and what's to come. So let's just jump right into it. To Abilities and Beyond, a look at the past, present, and future of 3.0. We've got another update for our Sandbox team to dive into, this time exploring more of our abilities and changes on the way to Subclass's fun with the next expansion. Destiny 2's newest damage type Strand is arriving in Lightfall, and we're beyond excited for you to play around with it, but that's not why you're here today. No, we don't want any additional Strand gameplay details to share just yet. Instead, we'll be talking about some general ability updates and quality of life changes we're making in Lightfall and beyond. The road traveled and the path ahead. With the release of Arc 3.0 alongside Season of Plunder, we completed moving all light subclasses to the Subclass 3.0 system. These updated subclasses allow players more customization and build crafting capabilities than ever before. Now that all the 3.0 subclasses are out in the wild, we have some tuning work to do on the various systems connected to these subclasses. One such system is our core character stats. The amount of ability regeneration that the discipline, strength, and class ability specific stats provide hasn't been meaningfully touched since the launch of Shadowkeep. Since then, across aspects, fragments, exotic armor, armor mods, and weapon perks, there are a variety of ways to have powerful abilities with very high uptime. This has resulted in some PvE activities losing the tension that made them special and introduced additional noise into the Crucible. Moving forward, our goal with ability uptime in both PvE and PvP is to get back to roughly where we were when the 30th anniversary pack launched in December 2021. We're making some changes to the ability energy economy in Lightfall and subsequent seasons to correct ability uptime, while still rewarding players for investing in build crafting and fine-tuning their Guardian into the perfect monster slaying machine. For Lightfall, we are making this following change focused on passive cooldown gains. Reskilled the efficacy of discipline, strength, and each class ability stat on grenade, melee, and class ability regeneration rates. In general, the regeneration provided by a tier 10 stat is now roughly equivalent to a tier 8 in the previous system. Each stat tier now provides a more consistent gain in cooldown reduction, rather than spiking heavily at lower tiers. I think this is honestly a really good change. It will be interesting to see how exactly this works out with everything being turned down to an equivalent of a tier 8. That's a 20% nerf across the board to all our cooldowns, so it'll be interesting to see exactly what happens there. Destiny 2 is a game about space magic, and your abilities will always be central to your combat loop. While this change looks like a lot on paper, we believe the build crafting improvements coming in Lightfall will more than make up for it. As a quick example, your legendary armor now has 3 type-specific mod slots, up from 2, that can fit a wide variety of mods that are no longer restricted by elemental affinity. This is true, although we still have a limited amount of energy, so we'll have to see exactly, how much things cost on our armor. Starting in Lightfall, you'll be able to run all the following ability energy generating mods at the same time, and more freely be able to socket multiple copies of each. This includes Bomber, Outreach, Impact Induction, Utility Kickstart, Melee Kickstart, and Grenade Kickstart, Invigoration, Insulation, and Innervation, and then Hands-On, Ashes to Assets, and Dynamo. Additionally, Armour Mod energy costs have been reduced across the board, there we go, and artifact mods no longer need to be slotted into your armor, giving you more space to build craft to your heart's content. In fact, so much is changing and being added in Lightfall that we expect players will find a unique combination of mods and perks that we didn't anticipate. In the coming seasons, we'll continue to tune the greater ability energy economy, along with the updates to specific ability potency to make them feel more powerful. In Lightfall, we'll also be adjusting the base cooldown of some grenade, melee, and class abilities. We'll provide more detailed information in the patch notes when Lightfall goes live. As a preview with Lightfall, we're reverting the base cooldown change to the dodge class ability that was implemented in hotfix 6.3.0.5, as we feel that their cooldown under the new stat scaling system is in a good place. Marksman dodge base cooldown reduced from 34 seconds to 29 seconds, and Gambler's dodge base cooldown reduced from 46 seconds to 38 seconds. That is a very big jump down. I'm not a Hunter main, but it's very interesting to see that both those dodges are going down in cooldown, but will they actually be a lower cooldown when you're built into mobility? Also, mobility sucks, so why would you build into mobility? Interesting, just to say the least. I think the mod and the energy changes, all good. It'll be interesting to see exactly how the tier 10, tier 8 change works. But mobility still sucks, so we'll have to see in the patch notes, I guess. Thanks, Bungie. Moving on. When in Rome. With the 30th anniversary release in December 2021, we split super regeneration times into separate tiers based on the damage potential of each super, with roaming supers generally having longer cooldowns than one-off supers. Yeah. While we still believe that a gradient of cooldown times based on each super's potency is healthier for the game, we also recognize that roaming supers have been taking a backseat in PvE content, particularly at higher difficulties where neutral game options have grown more capable of clearing groups of enemies with Subclass 3.0. We're working to address this problem, and we don't have a full suite of changes ready just yet. As a first step, in Lightfall, we're increasing the maximum number of orbs of power that roaming supers can generate from 5 to 7, and reducing the number of orbs that burst supers can create from 7 to 5. We believe this split more cleanly reinforces the gameplay role of these types of supers, and still provides space for burst supers to shine in combat. With future releases, we plan to do larger tuning paths to balance roaming super performance in higher tier content. Good to hear. Roaming supers, orb of power generation up to 7, one-off down to 5. Note the orb of power generation from Well of Radiance, Ward of Dawn, and both Shadow Shot variants is unchanged. Interesting. We are also making a change to the only 3 supers in our longest cooldown tier, reducing their base cooldown by 1 tier. Hammer of Soul, Daybreak, and Spectral Blades getting base cooldown reduced from 1025 to 916. I think that's a very good change, down a minute, over a minute. We'd also like to take this opportunity to detail a few ability-specific tuning changes coming with Lightfall. This is not a comprehensive list, which as always will be found in our patch notes, but it represents a portion of the major changes we're making. First up, Ward of Dawn. With Void 3.0, Ward of Dawn was reintroduced as a selectable super rather than being tied to Sentinel Shield. As we've introduced more objective game modes into the Crucible with Zone Control, Iron Banner, Fortress, and Zone Capture Trials, it's become clear that Ward of Dawn is overperforming. We don't want to reduce its functionality in PvE content, and generally we still want Ward of Dawn to be a strong option when you need to lock down a point on a map, but we're making a few changes to make dislodging players from Ward of Dawn more realistic in normal play. Ward of Dawn maximum health reduced from 13,500 down to 8,000. Damage dealt to the ward by PvE combatants has been reduced to compensate. In general, Ward of Dawn's effective health in PvE should not meaningfully change. It'll be interesting to see exactly what they mean by that. Okay, just Ward of Dawn nerf. Standardize the damage dealt by each type of kinetic and energy weapon against the ward itself. Previously, energies did 2.5 times damage to Ward of Dawn, and kinetic weapons did 1 times damage. Now, regardless of damage type, all weapons do 1.5 damage to the ward. Interesting. Armor of Light has been updated to reduce its potency in PvP. Maximum health reduced to 425 from 425 to 300. Wow. Now inherits Void Overshield's 50% PvE damage resistance. It didn't before? And no longer negates precision damage. Interesting. So, because of PvP and Iron Banner Fortress Bubble Titans, we just get a nerf kind of for PvE? Interesting. That'll be, of course it's mainly a PvP nerf, but we still get partly a PvE nerf, which I don't think Ward of Dawn needed at all. Similarly, Thunder Crash is currently proving to be too difficult to counter or escape in higher level Crucible modes and is too strong at both its pseudo roaming and shutdown roles. Our goal with these changes is to bring it in line without compromising on its fantasy of allowing you to be the missile. This also felt like a good opportunity to give Fist of Havoc a damage boost against PvE targets, so we're including that as well. Thunder Crash, reduced maximum flight time from 5 seconds to 4.5 seconds. Oh. Reduced size of the damaging volume around the player while in flight by 20% and pushed it further forward in front of the player to make flyby disintegrations more intentional. Descent now begins earlier in flight. Reduced landing detonation size versus players by 20%. Unchanged versus PvE targets, and Fist of Havoc gets an increased PvE damage by 20%. Of course, the roaming super buff is nice. That's very interesting that they're reducing the flight time. I mean, in PvE, that doesn't totally matter. As well as they are reducing the size of the damaging volume around the player while in flight by 20% and pushed it further and forward. I don't think barely anyone ever gets hit by the damaging volume. I think if you are midair and a Titan Super is coming at you, you get exploded and hit by them before you get disintegrated, so that's interesting. Arc 3.0's Spark of Resistance fragment is achieving our intended goal of making close-range combat safer to engage with, but it's a bit too easy to keep rolling throughout an entire PvE encounter or Crucible skirmish. We're making a couple of changes here to increase the difficulty of doing so without changing its potency while you're in the fray. Spark of Resistance increased nearby enemy count requirement for activation from 2 to 3, reduced linger time after you're no longer surrounded from 4 seconds to 2 seconds. Oh, that's kind of bad. Jeez, 4 to 2 seconds, that's gonna make it really hard to get close to ranged enemies that are currently shooting you, because that's the thing, you go into a group of enemies, you kill them all, and then you move on to the next, and Spark of Resistance allows you that resistance to get closer to the next enemies. But interesting, if it's reduced down to 2 seconds, that runs out pretty quickly. But it's Arc, so we'll have to see in game. With Solar 3.0, the increased Daybreak duration provided by Dawnblade's attunement to Flame Path was removed, which was left Daybreak in a lackluster place. With Lightfall, in addition to cooldown reduction detailed above, we're reducing its attack cost and increasing its damage output against PvE targets. Super energy cost reduced from 10% to 6.5% per swing, and increased PvE damage by 25%. Interesting. Daybreak possibly up in the damage? Now, the super energy cost reduced, but I guess the attack speed is decent enough. And we'll have to see, of course, we'll have to do some damage testing. Phoenix Dive has also struggled to find a solid role in most gameplay styles, and it is too difficult to justify picking over Healing or Empowering Rift, so we're making a suite of changes to increase its viability across game modes, including a base cooldown reduction. I think is fantastic. Phoenix Dive base cooldown reduced from 82 seconds to 55 seconds, wow. While Heat Rises is active, Phoenix Dive restoration duration increased from 1 second to 3 seconds. While Daybreak is active, Phoenix Dive cooldown significantly reduced, allowing for rapid reactivations. And while Daybreak is active, Phoenix Dive's detonation maximum damage increased from 80 to 220. That is big. Phoenix Dive will become an actual viable option, I think. I love that. I love Phoenix Dive personally, so we'll have to see, Warlock mains. Moving on, Crash Test Guardians. Pretty soon Guardians are getting a little sturdier. Starting in Lightfall, physics collision damage will no longer be lethal to Guardians. Fall damage will still be lethal when Lightfall launches, but we plan to also make that non-lethal in a mid-season update. You'll still take damage from physic collisions, but it will generally leave you at 1 HP instead of outright splattering you. We'll hope you'll take this newfound freedom and run with it. We found it more fun to hurl ourselves headlong into danger without worrying about what's in our way. We're Guardians after all. Absolutely right, the amount of times I have gone too fast and flung into a wall and died, as we have seen from the heist, when you're jumping down the Europa tunnel, you hit the ramp and then boom, you're dead. So that is crazy, no more collision damage. Of course, when Lightfall first comes out, you can still die from fall damage. But eventually, in the middle of the season, that'll be going away. Physic damage will only reduce you to 1 HP or however much damage it does. But that is crazy. No longer lethal. Wow. New tools in the arsenal. As part of our build crafting enhancement in Lightfall, we'll be adding some new fragments to the light subclasses and updating a handful of fragments on Solar and Void to tie into the new subclass pickups, Void Breaches, and Fire Sprites. Some of these fragment additions are intended as spiritual successors to the combat style mods that aren't making the jump over to the new build crafting system, and some are brand new additions intended to open access to subclass verbs that some classes didn't have before. Here are the details. Arc, Spark of Instinct, new! When critically wounded, taking damage from nearby enemies emits a burst of damaging arc energy that jolts targets. This is a rework of Reactive Pulse, looks great. Spark of Haste, new. You have greatly increased resilience, recovery, and mobility while sprinting. I think that's fantastic. Moving on, Solar. Fire Sprite, new. Fire Sprites are created by a suite of new and existing solar fragments and grant grenade energy on pickup. Ember of Mercy, new. When you revive an ally, you and other nearby allies gain restoration. Picking up a fire sprite grants restoration. Ember of Resolve, new. Solar Grenade final blows now cure you. Solar Warlocks, rejoice. Ember of Tempering now creates a fire sprite on solar weapon kills while active in addition to its original effects. Ember of Combustion now creates a fire sprite on solar super debuffs in addition to its original effects, and Ember of Searing now creates a fire sprite when defeating scorched targets in addition to its original effects. All fantastic, I think that's great. And then finally, Void. We have the Void Breach, new. Void Breaches are created by a selection of new and existing Void fragments and class ability energy on pickup. Echo of Cessation, new. Finisher final blows create a burst of void damage that cause nearby enemies to become volatile. Defeating volatile targets creates a void breach. Ooh, very interesting. Echo of Vigilance, new. Defeating a target when your shields are depleted grants you a temporary void overshield. Ooh, that's very good. Damn, that's very good. Echo of Domineering now creates a void breach when defeating suppressed targets in addition to its original effects. Echo of Harvest now creates a void breach when defeating weakened targets with precision damage in addition to its original effects. And Echo of Starvation now grants Devour on picking up a void breach in addition to its original effects. Interesting. In case you missed it, the build crafting update from a couple weeks back, we've also added many ways for your subclass keywords to counter champions. While we still expect weapons and seasonal artifact mods to be your primary way to counter champions in high-level PvE content, we found that the subclass keywords are a solid complement to round out your loadouts and get your team out of a tight spot when an unstoppable champion is barreling towards you. We'll be keeping an eye on this when it goes live, and we're excited to see players use it. That's it from the gameplay team today. We hope you look forward to Lightfall, and we'll see you on the other side. I have to say, these honestly look really good. Now, some of these, like the Hunter dodge change, will Some of these will have to actually do some testing when Lightfall comes out, because it's unsure if it's a nerf or a buff, actually. But at least for these new tools, these new fragments that we're getting in the updates to old fragments, I think these are fantastic. The ideas of the fire sprites and void breaches, I think they're going to be very popular and also be very cool. So it seems like we have a lot of ways to basically, like they said, we have a lot of ways to offset the kind of nerfs that they're doing to ability energy regen in all, because we have void breaches and fire sprites which allow us to get our abilities back faster. So that does it for the blog post. Now, we covered the blog post and it was a fantastic read through, but we have an exclusive interview from Press Start Australia where Kevin Yates and Eric Smith come back to talk a little bit more about Strand and the updates from the blog post today. Now, to start off, they talk a little bit about what makes Strand so different from the other subclasses, and they talk about how the loop of Strand is very unique, in inclusion with the tangles, and how you can mix and match, and how the different fragments actually affect the tangles themselves. So they're very leaning into how Strand is just completely different than anything we've ever had before, and I think they're honestly really right here. So another thing they touch on is that there's actually grapple tangles that exist, which they say are more ethereal. You can pick up and throw them for an explosion, and you can still grapple to them for free. And apparently those will just be scattered around Neomuna as you were traversing through the campaign. They also say that, of course, with Strand being in the Lightfall campaign, the Lightfall campaign specifically was affected by the new movement options of Grapple and Strand. So it'd be interesting to see how classes will be able to traverse normally, but I'm guessing there'll be a lot more shortcuts where Strand can come in handy. They also talk about, of course, how you can do a bunch of new things in existing raids and strikes that you could never do before with Strand. Now, it is discussed here as it was discussed in the PC Gamer interview, but pretty much once you complete the campaign, you will have Strand, and as you play through the campaign, you will unlock Strand very quickly, much quicker than Stasis was done, as they have learned a lot about how god-awful that was. And kind of lastly, the most important kind of detail that they talk about is basically, of course, the design team is very creative, except for the Titans. And of course we are getting a 6th class and damage type with final shape. Of course they don't outright say it, but Yanes does go on saying that of course they have lots of ideas they have unused and will most likely go back to in the future. They talk about how Strand already introduces so many mechanics and stuff, and how a new subclass has to do that. It can't just be a simple addition, it's something that has to fit into the game and evolve the game as it enters, but also the game evolves with the subclass, like all that. It has to work. So I think it's, I think it's beautiful. I think Strand's going to be really good. Obviously, there's a lot to talk about and there's a lot to go into when Lightfall actually drops, but right now I feel like we actually have a pretty good preview of things to come. Thank you so much for listening and watching. This has been FreakyDude99. I hope you have a fantastic day, and of course, we'll see you in the next video. Peace out, everyone.